Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our third webinar in commemoration of the legacy of Louis Riel and celebrating Métis people in honor of Louis Riel Day, which was yesterday, November 16th. This week, we're hosting daily lunch and learns from 12 to 1. We understand that there may be folks who may only be able to make one of the lunch and learns, so you might find a bit of duplicate information in each session, along with a lot of new content each day. So just so everyone's aware, this webinar today is being recorded so that we can share all of these experiences and these teachings across Vancouver Coastal Health, and so that we can keep it as a reference for the staff in the future. We would like to encourage everyone to share your thoughts, maybe pictures of the events of this week on social media. So if you can, please do use the tag at VCH Healthcare, all one word. So at VCH Healthcare, feel free to take screenshots or anything, selfies with your laptop. So now this would be a time that I would normally ask folks to come off of Zoom. To come off of mute on the Zoom and say hello to everyone in the virtual circle. But just because of the size of the group and the amount of time that we have it's limited, that won't quite allow us to do that. So instead, I'm inviting everyone to plant both feet solidly on the ground. I'll take a deep breath. And imagine that you're entering a virtual circle with your colleagues at this time. So I would just first like to invite our presenters to introduce themselves before we move on to a land honoring. Brianna, would you like to give us this brief introduction, please?
Sure. I'll go more into detail when we talk about our personal stories. My name is Brianna Laurie. I'm one of the Indigenous leads for facilitation with the Indigenous Cultural Safety Team here at Indigenous Health. And yeah, I'll go more into when we talk about each other.
Thanks, Brianna. And Jesse, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Jesse Dane, very proudly Two-Spirit and Métis. I will also speak a little bit more about my family and where my family is from in the next little bit here, but I am the lead within Indigenous Gender and Sexual Health on the Indigenous Women's and Families team, calling in among the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo First Nations in what we now know as South Surrey White Rock. Nice to see everybody again.
Thank you, Jesse and Brianna. And my name is James Rankin. My pronouns are he, him. My role in Vancouver Coastal Health is the strategic lead for Indigenous cultural safety. I'm a father, a son, partner, uncle and nephew, and cousin to many. I am residing on the unceded homelands and calling in from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So as I move forward into the presentation now, I'd like to begin with an honoring. So we are honoring that we're hosting today's Lunch and Learn on the ancestral unceded homelands of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam peoples. They have been the original stewards of these lands since time immemorial. So unceded, as we may know, is a legal term that means that the land has never been ceded or given up to the Crown through any treaties or other agreements. Essentially, the land was just taken. We recognize that Vancouver is located on unceded territory. This term, unceded, serves as a reminder that the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples will always retain their ancestral and their traditional relationships with these lands. We also know that we have folks joining us from throughout Vancouver Coastal Health. And at this point, we'd like to invite everyone to acknowledge where they're joining from which traditional homelands they're joining from in the chat window. Vancouver Coastal Health serves 14 First Nations communities and 2 chartered Métis communities. And those communities include the territories of the Kitasoo, the Nuhulk, the Wikinu, the Kwakwa, Lillooet, Shamakwam, Skatine, Haksha, Sechelt, Suquamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. We want to recognize and respect the diversity of each individual nation, and we as staff and privileged employees of Vancouver Coastal Health, we are committing to meaningful collaboration, consultation, and inclusion with host nations as we deliver health services and programs and as we seek to decolonize and improve our healthcare systems. We acknowledge the land in this way because we want to demonstrate our shared history that's brought us together to reside on these lands. And we want to seek our own understanding of our place within that history. Land acknowledgements aren't meant to exist in a past tense or in a historical context. They can sometimes be viewed as performative. Instead of them being performative, we feel that it's important to bring our own personal and historical context and bringing the mindfulness and our participation in unlearning and learning the truth about the history of this country and Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Sometimes learning and decolonizing and this kind of work can be uncomfortable, and we want to embrace the awkwardness of that. We want to create those spaces of dialogue and discussion and responsible truth-telling so that we can continue to move forward in a good way. The acknowledgement recognizes and identifies Indigenous peoples who have not always had a voice in this work, and it's an active way to combat harmful colonial narratives of Indigenous erasure. Land acknowledgement and land honoring is a sign of acknowledgement and respect. Indigenous peoples have always asked permission to do work when in someone else's territory, whether it's hunting, fishing, trading, or ceremony. So we always encourage everyone to ask permission from the caretakers and stewards of these lands. And this is part of our ongoing work of reconciliation. Just would like to highlight the voice of one of the chiefs of Squamish Nation, Chief Ian Campbell. Land acknowledgements are important in recognizing Canada's attempt to alienate and marginalize Indigenous peoples from their homelands to make way for settlers. Indigenous people have been invisible in their own lands, thereby recognizing First Nations connection to these lands is an act of reconciliation and decolonization. In committing to this act, we can celebrate our shared journey. So I will invite my co-host and co-presenter, Jesse Dane, to speak a little bit of our intentions today now.
Thanks, James. So as some of you may have heard on Tuesday, a lot of my work is in relationality and intention setting, and just really that deeper connection with oneself and that vulnerability that really lays or that vulnerability that can really happen in these spaces when we come in with the best and warmest intentions. So our goal for today is to share some of our experiences as Métis folks, as well as engage in some open and honest dialogue and connect to each other on a deeper level. So really creating a space for discussion, sharing stories, and asking questions. And I think I always just like to remind folks when we're asking questions to make sure that we're reflexive on the questions and the tone of the questions that we're asking, so that we are always thoughtful of the person who may be responding to the question and ensuring that nobody is hurt in the process, because I know all of us have great intentions, but sometimes tone or language use can be harmful, because language is a living item that's always changing and always growing, which I know in my area within sex and gender can be difficult sometimes, but it is a beautiful way for us to connect together and continue to learn. So just truly setting that intention, vulnerability, and openness so that we can all be in this space together virtually and learn together and grow together. So I'll pass it back to you, James, or is Brianna next, I think?
Thank you. Yeah, I would invite Brianna now to speak to us about her history.
Thanks, James and Jesse. So as I said earlier, my name's Brianna Laurie. So my family, my mom is her father was born in Nipawin, Saskatchewan on the reserve. His father was Métis and his mother was Cree. But of course, back then, unfortunately, she lost her status due to marrying a Métis man. And yeah, my grandpa moved to Prince George when he was quite young. I met my grandmother, who is German and like French, Dutch, and then my father is Scottish through and through and through and through, and still lives in Scotland now. So yeah, so growing up for me, I I kind of shared this actually with my team yesterday. So I didn't really know like what we were, I guess, and or like who we were, where our family's from. It was definitely a point of shame, especially for my mom and especially for my grandfather. My grandfather was like a very outward facing like Cree man, and yeah, he struggled a lot with that and what that meant. And I remember when he passed, one of his friends came to his like celebration of life, and he said that my grandfather had shared with him that no matter how hard he worked, it didn't matter because of what he looked like. So I've always kind of like lived in this like very strange world. Obviously I'm very white presenting, and when I was a little girl, I asked my mom if we were Native, and my mom was like, if you want to be. And I was like, what does this mean? So it's always been a very weird journey for me. And growing up, like grandpa would take me to powwows, and like we like kind of dabbled, but like I just never really knew where I fit, as well as also being like from a Métis background as well as Cree, and not like being a part of either like culture or anything like that. So yeah, so I've always been very called to work with Indigenous like folks. And yeah, I have been with VCH since 2014 in the role of a respiratory therapist. And while working at VCH ICU, I was very lucky enough to meet both Lori and Emily McLeod. And Emily and I had a really great friendship, and we really talked openly and honestly about our Métis heritage and like what that meant to us, and like kind of like rediscovering this, reclaiming it, and kind of being the first people in our family to be proud of that versus shameful, to be completely honest. And yeah, we would have such great conversations about this, and I've always been pulled to do some sort of work in this capacity. And Emily moved into Indigenous Health, and then kind of had me on some special projects and helping her out in a respiratory therapy perspective. And then last year in December of 2021, she reached out and asked for me to apply to Indigenous Patient Navigator role. And yeah, I mean, there is a lot of factors going on, but I have always been really called to, like I said, do this work. And so I did, and I kind of haven't looked back. I've been now with the team since February officially, initially as an Indigenous Patient Navigator, working both here or at VGH and Lionsgate. And then in August, I moved into the role with the Indigenous Cultural Safety team, with facilitating primarily the Indigenous Cultural Safety course. Yeah, which has been a massive learning curve, and it's been really great experience. And yeah, like throughout this last 11 months now, 10 months, it's been so incredible. I really value my experience and like every single moment and minute that I've gotten to share with the elders, especially I've done a lot of circle with Elder Blair on Wednesdays at the Hope Center at Lionsgate. And he really was like, I would say like a pivotal thing for me to like really reclaiming my heritage. And he like we were just talking very candidly one day, and he was like, you really need to stop saying that your grandfather is Cree and Métis. And he's like, you are Cree and Métis. And he's like, that's like a part of who you are. If your grandfather didn't exist, like you wouldn't exist, and like blah, blah, blah. And of course I was like crying, and I was like, thank you. So I just have felt very honored to have reconnected like with my lineage and heritage through work in a professional way, which has been very interesting. So yeah, I'm still very much like in the middle of my journey, I would say, in like trying to reclaim things. And I'm still trying to like reach out to family members and like figure things out of like where like more details into our family, because unfortunately my grandfather did pass away in 2013. So I don't really get him as a sounding board. Yeah, and a little story with him, he was kind of in and out of healthcare most of my childhood. So he unfortunately suffered a few strokes and heart attacks and actually had an above the knee amputation secondary to vascular issues. So yeah, I spent a lot of time in hospital with him, which I think, like, I know hearing from so many people, they're like, oh, my like so-and-so member passed away in hospital, like I could never work in a hospital, I don't know how you do it. And I'm like, I like feel like that was just like my like weirdly second home since I was a little girl. So yeah, I've just always felt very called to this work, and I know that my grandpa is with me like on this journey through this. I do wish that he was here with me now to kind of really see like this amazing change happening, especially within the healthcare system, because he was very much victim to it. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say about my family. And I will also add that this photo of me, I am a dog mom, which is probably my favorite role in the whole world. I should probably also say my partner and my cat mom and granddaughter, daughter, cousin, and yeah, friend and coworker. So thank you so much, everyone. I'll pass it on. I think Jesse is next. So
Yes.
thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Brianna.
Thanks, Brianna. Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. Very excited to be having this conversation. So as we know, or as I said, my name is Jesse Dame, very proudly Two-Spirit and Métis. So my mom, I am a member of Métis Nation through my mom's family, who are originally from Treaty 1 territory. And my father, my biological father, is originally from Treaty 2 territory, which we now know as Winnipeg and St. Roselac, both in Manitoba. But I was born and raised in Stola territory in Mission, Abbotsford area in BC, and a member of Métis Nation BC for majority of my life. My mom is the granddaughter of Marie Louise Breland, who is the daughter of Pascal Breland Jr., son of Pascal Breland Sr., who married Maria Grant and Cuthbert Grant's daughter. So majority of my family is deeply rooted within the Grants and the Brelands, which are two pretty common Métis families throughout the prairies. So meet a lot of cousins and a lot of folks who are descendants from the Grants and the Brelands. Was on a call with Two Spirits in Motion, which is the national Two-Spirit organization, the other day, and met another Two-Spirit woman from St. Rose, who is actually like my third cousin. So it's just always those beautiful connections that we can find when we have conversations with folks and we locate ourselves with who we are and where we're from. So today I wanted to share just a little bit about my experience and my history being Métis and how it's deeply rooted in my current practice and how I live my day every day. So I grew up knowing that I was Métis. I didn't completely understand what that meant growing up in Abbotsford and Mission. I did always know that it was rooted within the Indigenous, or at the time the Aboriginal umbrella, but I didn't really know or understand the complexities of intersecting identities and all the pieces. So majority of my life, I was in elementary and in high school. I took part within the Indigenous programming, but never met a Métis elder or really did Métis activities within the communities that I lived in. So just kind of felt similar to Brianna's experience, that kind of in between stage of trying to figure out exactly where I fit and who I kind of connected to, especially with very fair skin. So it was when I was in my teens that it was the first time I met a Métis elder. And I remember being like, oh, there's Métis elders? Like, like that's a thing? Like that was just such a moment for me of like realization that it is that Métis community, and it was much more than just me finding out that I was Métis, that there was larger Métis communities, even in Abbotsford and throughout the Fraser Valley and throughout all of BC. So it was once I started connecting with some of the Métis elders and knowledge keepers that lived around me, I really started to dive more into the Métis community and Métis culture, quickly learning that some of the things that were happening at home, some of the food, some of the activities were completely from the Métis culture, but didn't completely connect the two or connect the dots at that time. So it was a beautiful realization for me as I went into my teens and was really diving in deeper into my heritage and my family. It was definitely when I was in my like mid-teens, I met a Métis elder in Merritt, BC. And it was at that moment when I really connected to my community, because that was the first time that I heard the term Two-Spirit. I'll speak a little bit to Two-Spirit in a moment, but I just want to share this story for me and how this was a foundational moment in my healthcare career, but also in my entire life. So it was where I first heard the term Two-Spirit. In the meeting, the Métis elder was sharing a bunch of different experiences and teachings that they had learned growing up in the prairies and before they arrived in Merritt, BC. That's again, the first time I heard the term Two-Spirit and what that meant. And in that conversation, she explained that Two-Spirit people, that Two-Spirit queer and trans Indigenous people were a part of community, were a celebrated part of community. And it wasn't this binary limitation that we now unfortunately experience in Western society. And she explained just all these beautiful moments and beautiful connections for the Two-Spirit community and how it was seen as a gift. And I'm not putting on rose-colored glasses, not saying there wasn't any forms of discrimination, of course, but through the teachings and through the stories that have been passed down, it was a true realization that queer folks, Two-Spirit folks, the limitations and the discrimination that we feel now, that was not a part of the history of my Métis relative, of my ancestry and within the Indigenous realms. And that was the first time that I had ever truly felt how healing culture can be, how healing learning about your history, how healing learning about tradition, how healing learning about something that I didn't even know that was completely missing from my life could heal me and allow me to open up in a different way. And then that's when I started on my very clear journey and path of healing myself, but also working with community to explore within the realms of the Two-Spirit concept, but also just for a kinder, better world. Because that's when I really started hearing more teachings and stories and just finding those 7 sacred teachings of like the base foundation of just love, kindness, and warmth. And that's the end goal for everybody. So that was the moments that I truly started to feel somebody and family members and relatives and people taking the rocks out of my backpack growing up as a queer teen in Abbotsford with a lot of other things around me. So it was that connection with a Métis elder, learning about histories, learning about some of the community teachings that I really started to dive back into learning about myself more, and really started that journey of not just physical healing, but emotional, mental, spiritual, and sexual health healing. So all of the different levels and aspects of ourselves. And it was a beautiful moment. And just quickly for folks who maybe haven't seen some of my other presentations or have really come across the term of Two-Spirit, it's not just a sexual orientation nor a gender. It is definitely inclusive of these factors, but it is a term that is used to connect to something much bigger than just singular pieces, but overall connection to creator and one's responsibility to community. And it is deeply rooted in indigeneity. So it is a term that is the term itself, Two-Spirit, was born in the 90s, but the concept itself is as old as time. And it's that in-between realms of expression and ability to navigate different places. And it wasn't just about sexual orientation or gender. It was more about your roles and responsibilities in community. And I'm happy to have further conversations with folks after today about that. But I think it's a huge part for me within my Métis identity and how connected it is to the Two-Spirit concept. After that journey, and in Merritt, I a couple of years later started my nursing degree in Kamloops, BC, to Kamloops, and was very thankful to go to TRU, where be very careful how I speak. There was some Indigenous content. I would say TRU maybe be ahead of the game for some folks, or ahead of the awareness for some folks. It's a lot different now. That was 15 years ago, I guess, when I started. So, or I guess, yeah, 13 years ago when I started. So it's changed a bit, but back then there wasn't very much Indigenous content. So TRU definitely had some, and I was able to connect to community. Went straight into the NICU after finishing my nursing undergrad, neonatal intensive care unit. And that's where I started to get some experiences with a number of different Indigenous parents. Within those realms, I felt a a huge draw to community, to Indigenous community. And though I got to meet a number of folks in the NICU, it was definitely not the right fit for me in an acute care setting. So after meeting a number of folks, I did a sexual health specialty and then went rural and remote for a bit and got to work in some of the northern communities in BC, where I really felt at home, felt welcomed, felt that true strength of community and beauty. And I think that's where we kind of had this conversation on Tuesday, but sharing our identity and sharing a piece of ourselves as Indigenous folks, as an Métis person, it just really reinforces that connection to community. So when I was in community and would have great conversations, and there was other Métis folks in some of the northern communities, other First Nations folks, so just really connecting with people. Unfortunately, the 5 weeks in, 5 weeks out didn't completely work for my family, so I moved back to Vancouver, where I worked in a sexual health clinic downtown, in a queer sexual health clinic, where I got to meet a number of different folks, including a number of different Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous folks who made their way to the bigger cities. It was through a lot of that work where I really started to learn more about histories within the Métis community, but it was overall Indigenous community, about sex and gender, about the binary, like how the patriarchy came in and completely took over, and how the matriarchal societal structure that was before, what I felt very connected to, was removed, forcibly removed through colonization and of course, we know that pathway. So it was in these moments of realization about the forced binary, toxic masculinity, number of things that came in, that I really started to investigate Indigenous conceptual understandings of masculinity and of the binary and of things that are deeply rooted to histories and teachings. And that's when I started to do my master's, and then that's what led me into this beautiful role today, which I'm very thankful to be in. So just wanted to share that kind of path of how that singular moment with a Métis elder and those histories kind of led me on a direct path to where I'm at in my career now, and the work that I get to do every single day, and the privilege of working with and for the Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous community, but also overall the Indigenous community, with some very strong Indigenous women on our team and Indigenous queer folks within the realms. And I just feel very, very lucky and honored to be on this team and be doing this work every day. I just want to share one more piece, and then I'm going to pass it over to James before we can open it up to questions. But I think Brianna kind of spoke to it too, and I want to share a teaching that Harlan Pruden, who's a Two-Spirit knowledge keeper and mentor and idol and many things to me, shared with me a couple years ago. I was working with him, and I felt some of my insecurities coming in, and some of my placement, like just unsure of my role and my responsibility in community as a Métis person, but as a very white presenting person, and made a comment to Harlan, just being like, I don't feel Indigenous enough to be in these spaces. Like I'm anxious, and it was really stimulating a lot of emotion and feeling for me. And I didn't know what to do about that. So he sat there, looked at me, looked away, looked at me again, and said, I want you to take a moment and invert that question and turn and reflect on how that exact feeling is what actually makes you more Indigenous. Because that's the system, the systemic barriers and the systemic dissection that occurred that actually results in those feelings, and that every Indigenous person feels that. So it was this moment of like connection. I still get goosebumps just thinking about it, when I was just like, holy, like, whoa, what an interesting thought. And he's like, that's one of the most common themes or threads, unfortunately, throughout Indigenous communities, is that colonization and so many things makes us question whether you are Indigenous enough. And it's not about blood quantum, it's about your roles and your responsibilities to community and your connection to community. And that's your responsibility to keep up and to work within. So I like to share that piece that he gifted for me to share, and the feelings that for anybody else in the room who has that feeling sometimes, it's through that question that actually can challenge some of the forced separation that the system wants us to feel. It's also that realization that the system wants us to feel isolated. The system wants us to feel alone, right? So it's that challenging, utilizing that perspective to challenge it and flip it on its head and use it for the power of good. Like I said the other day, using it for the power of good. But I'll pass it back over to you, James. Thanks for everybody for listening and letting me share a part of my experience and story over the last little bit.
Wow, thank you, Jesse. That was really wonderfully spoken. I really appreciate your words. Apologies for changing the slide there briefly for you at the end. I was trying to give you applause and clicked the wrong thing. So I'll just stick to hosting. How about that? So thank you for the time, for the opportunity to speak. I will share a little bit of a story of that I've written up about my family history. So apologies if it doesn't come off as naturally, but I just felt this was the best way to share my story. So I come from a large family. I am the eldest of 4 children, and my mother was one of 6 kids. My Métis ancestry is through my mother's side, specifically my maternal grandfather. Elmer John Bernard. Elmer John Bernard was the 7th of 15 children in a Catholic family. He used to always tell us how lucky he was, seeing as he was the 7th son of the 7th son. So John Bernard, or as we used to call him, Papa, was born in Victoria Harbour on the edge of Lake Huron, Ontario. His parents were both Métis, and they came from Wikwemikong on Manitoulin Island. His parents were descendants of the Drummond Island voyageurs, who were forced to move off Drummond Island during the Canada-US War of 1812. My Papa's father was baptized in Wikwemikong. Part of the history of Wikwemikong is that it was a place where Indigenous peoples from Ontario and Quebec had been forced to move to and relocate. In the 1901 Canadian census, my grandfather's dad's entire family was registered with the letter R, which signified red or Indigenous. Later in the 1911 Canadian census, the family was listed as FB, which stood for French half-breed or French-speaking Métis. These racist terminologies were very common at that time in the Canadian census. When I was growing up, my Papa did not speak about his Métis heritage. He'd grown up in a white settler community in a strongly Catholic part of Ontario, the town of Victoria Harbour. If you were to drive just about a few kilometers west down the road from Victoria Harbour, you'll arrive at Martyrs Shrine. Also known as the Shrine of the Canadian Martyrs, this Roman Catholic church in Midland, Ontario is consecrated to the Canadian martyrs, who were 8 Jesuit missionaries from the mission of Sainte Marie among the Hurons. In the mid-17th century, they were ritually tortured and killed during the warfare between the Mohawk and the Huron. I can imagine that when my Papa was growing up, it was more important and probably safer for him to identify as a Catholic white child than as Métis, or for that matter, as having any Indigenous ancestry. My Papa married, he moved to Sarnia, Ontario at the southern tip of Lake Huron, and he raised 6 kids. Sarnia is also an interesting place I'd like to speak about. It's a working class hub of oil refineries and petrochemical plants. Sarnia has about 72,000 inhabitants, but there are more than 60 oil refineries and chemical plants that sit in a 15-mile wide section just outside of town, which is known as Chemical Valley. The most at-risk place in Sarnia is the Amjinan First Nation. Amjinan is an Ojibwe word that means at the spawning stream. In this case, it's along the St. Clair River and along the shores of Lake Huron. Home to about 2,500 Chippewa peoples, the reservation is surrounded by and downriver from these petroleum refineries and petrochemical plants. The close quarters means that the factory accidents there come at a high cost. There are daycares, schools, workplaces, and public parks that have all seen waves of illnesses that residents blame on refinery spills. To be clear, my grandfather did not live on Amjinan First Nation Reserve. He lived in the town of Sarnia, but Sarnia I think is a reflection of Canada's way of displacing and harming Indigenous peoples through environmental warfare. Many of my family members still live in Sarnia, and there you can find still today racist representations of Indigenous women on motel signs, like the Chippekan Motel. On my most recent visit last weekend, I learned that during her youth, my Aunt Mary, so my mother's sister and my godmother, she was crowned as an Indian princess at a local festival in her youth. So this form of cultural appropriation And the usage of the term Indian would have been a way to exoticize her appearance, such as her facial features and her long hair, but to do so in a coded and celebratory way. At the time, Aunt Mary did not know as a child that she had Métis heritage. Other members of my extended family are also more visibly Indigenous than I. One of my cousins even hosted a program on Aboriginal People's Television Network about 15 years ago. So where does that leave me? I have had a difficult time coming to terms with my Métis ancestry. I was raised as a white, Catholic, English and French-speaking settler on the unceded homelands of the Kanien'kehá:ka and the Haudenosaunee nations, currently known as Montreal. My Métis heritage was only told to me in my late teenage years. At that point, I was proud to learn that I was in part Métis, but I was also very conflicted about my identity. I know that I've benefited from white privilege and generational wealth. I grew up in a suburban home and I was not connected to my Métis history. At times, I've felt like an imposter to claim that I'm Métis, let alone Indigenous. But at the same time, to ignore that part of myself would be to turn my back on my late grandfather and on the history that he himself felt unable to share. One of the ways I try to connect with my Métis ancestry is to seek out and surround myself and learn from Indigenous matriarchs, leaders, and elders. I did schooling after my undergrad degree. I came back to Vancouver and did a degree in public health. And through public health, I was able to work with first the Haida Nation in Haida Gwaii for a year. I took some of my knowledge in arthritis research as a research coordinator and tried to design workshops that could assist and support Haida peoples in that community to be able to understand arthritis work. I wanted to do so in a way that was respectful, that was informative, and that did not come in as in any kind of white saviorism kind of work. But thanks to that experience, I was able to create connections and work for the first time in my life with Indigenous peoples. And I think before that, I always felt a little awkward and uncomfortable growing up in a white community where Indigenous peoples and white folks didn't interact. And by being able to work in Haida Gwaii, for the first time I felt welcomed and comfortable, and that changed completely my direction in my career in life. That work, it gave me so much experience that I was able to travel around the northern communities and around Haida Gwaii. And when I moved back to Vancouver with my partner, I was extremely fortunate to begin working with First Nations Health Authority. I was a liaison there for several years, and the liaison work gave me the privilege and the good fortune to travel to 13 of the 14 communities in the Vancouver coastal region. And I felt that that work brought me to where I am today. Thanks to the schooling that I've done and to the work that I've done abroad in other countries, I've also learned how to speak 5 languages. The thing is, none of those languages are Indigenous languages. And so as a white presenting settler, now with the ability to learn and to speak other languages, I know that I have a responsibility, among many other responsibilities, to learn, to promote the languages and the words of my ancestors, so in the Métis language, but also the languages of the peoples on whose lands I am fortunate now to live. So that's a bit of how I try to bring reconciliation to my work, but also as I try to make reparations to Indigenous peoples for the privilege that I've been able to benefit from. So that's the section of our speakers. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment so we can all see each other here. And I'd like to, at this point, open the floor to some discussion questions that we've worked on together as a team. So for our co-hosts here, for Brianna, Jesse, and myself, one of our first questions for our panel today was, how has your Métis identity influenced your life or your experience as a health professional? And Brianna, would you like to speak to that?
Sorry. Sure. Are we doing a panel or will we just like feed off each other? No.
I think we can try to feed off naturally off each other like that, and I'll give Jesse and myself a chance to speak too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I feel I spoke to that a little bit. Obviously, it kind of has like derailed my career path initially, but it's honestly made me such a better respiratory therapist as well at the bedside. And yeah, just being more aware and just being like working towards that cultural like safety of just being like very like culturally humility or what's the word? Sorry, I'm a little bit sick and my brain fog is a little bad. Sorry. Yeah, I just think like I am a lot more open. It's really changed like for me, like personally and professionally. Yeah, I feel like I answered this already in my thing, so I
Sure.
feel like I don't want to
Thank you.
repeat myself.
Thanks, Brianna.
I can jump in a little bit too. Yeah, I think I kind of alluded to it in mine as well, but I think it was the biggest shift for me was through Western healthcare and systems. It's very selfish and very individual. And I think through especially the last couple of years and the amazing folks that I've been able to connect to and learn from, it's that shift in thinking and that shift in perspective that community is first, community is center, and then I am like, you know, it's more about my responsibilities to community and to working with folks. Whereas I feel like there's the Western like approach can be very individual, very selfish is typically like a very negative word, not to say it's a good thing or a bad thing, but like very individual, very self-centered. Whereas now I feel like that perspective is my responsibility is community. My responsibility is to advocate and take back space in realms so that either Indigenous women or Two-Spirit, queer and trans Indigenous folks or other folks can take that space back as well in any path that I can try and carve out.
Thanks, Jesse. And thank you, Brianna. I feel that, yeah, you both spoke very well to that. I recognize, Jesse, when you said, you made the allusion to using our skills and our abilities for good and our powers for good. And therefore, I think that kind of is how I feel about it as well, that we, as educated professionals, as anyone in these lands, have tremendous responsibility to give back and to bring our expertise to the original inhabitants of these lands, because racism and colonialism continues to exist every day. We have the ability to change the system internally, as we do in this team, and I think it's fantastic that we also have the opportunities, as we do today, to speak about this as a team and as a group. We were going to ask our next question for our panelists. What would you recommend for any non-Indigenous folks to become a meaningful ally? How can they work towards the things that we've been speaking about like that?
I'm happy to start with this one. I think allyship is a hot topic right now for many folks and what that actually means. I think allyship is not a term that one can give themselves. It's more of a term that may or may not be kind of gifted to you as an ally. I think it's taking up or fighting for that space even when Indigenous people are not in the room. It's not just a sticker or a plaque. It's not just adding pronouns or just it's fighting for that space even when Indigenous people or queer folks are not in the room, and that it's also listening to our requests. I think one of the biggest things that I see, especially in a lot of the work, is the dissection of requests from Indigenous communities, and it's prove to me why you need this stuff. And it's like, it's not, your job as an ally, it's okay, an Indigenous community, like we need certain items. We are like, this is what we need to continue to move forward. As an ally, your role is to support the work and support folks to get what they need. Obviously within reason, but like it's not to dissect requests. It's not to just put a sticker up. It's real allyship is showing up and doing the hard work. So as a Métis person, who proudly identifies Indigenous, but also wants to support First Nations and Inuit relatives and kin, is my role is to fight and advocate when other folks aren't in the room within the realms of birth work, but also throughout the many areas that I get to explore or work in.
I agree. I feel like it's like every small little step. So whether that's like you're sitting at home and you're having a discussion with your family member, or whether you're calling like your premier and requesting calls to actions to be taken like up and things like that. So I feel like there's a spectrum, but really just doing that work behind closed doors and not it being performative is such a big thing, especially because I do think, unfortunately, in healthcare, especially, sometimes it can feel very performative, and especially like doing the ICS facilitating, it's like people's sentiment about land acknowledgements or honorings. They do sometimes feel like it is performative because it's like part of the policy and things like that. So just taking that extra step and really like just even for land acknowledgement, personalizing it, really bringing yourself into it. And yeah, like there's just so many layers to it. But I think like the biggest thing is really being the advocate behind closed doors.
Thanks, Brianna. I'd like to also include the idea, as both of you spoke to, about the ongoing self-learning and development that we can all do through the courses that exist. There are now, thankfully, and we're very fortunate to be in a time when there are so many anti-racism courses that exist, things that we can continue to take on in our free time. There are the work of decolonizing and anti-racism should be uncomfortable, difficult work. And I think that if we're not, if things are feeling the same, if the reality that we live in still feels comfortable and awkward for myself as a white presenting person, then I feel like I'm not doing the work that needs to be done to decolonize. I feel like I'm just staying with the status quo, and that's not changing the system, and that's not making a meaningful change. So I think there are also so many resources that exist to better understand anti-racism work in our society that are out there for people to take on in their own free time. We have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to give folks on the call an opportunity to speak now as well. So we have a few questions for our audience.
I think, James, there's actually some questions in the chat too. I don't know if we want to. Yeah.
Oh, can we? Yes,
yeah.
thank you. I hadn't noticed in the chat. Yes.
Yeah. So Lori wants to know, how has making space in the system felt to you? I think we don't always understand how that feels as colleagues, and I want to know how I can make the space feel easier and better. Great question, Laura. Thank you, and other folks who also are on the similar wavelength. I think I don't know, Brianna or James, you want to go first?
No, take it away, Jesse.
I think we're very fortunate, or from my experience, very fortunate in the realms like within Indigenous health, but in connecting with other Indigenous folks, there typically is not, from my experience, even as a Métis person, as soon as I connect as a Métis person, it shifts. Like there is a very clear shift in connection and relationality that happens within Indigenous realms. And like blood quantum, skin tone, those things all kind of just quickly disappear. And the welcomeness and the welcome that I felt more specifically on my small Nicole, who's on the call, like just the open arms and caring warmth that comes from community, especially Indigenous women, especially within those realms of like the matriarchy and our elders and our knowledge keepers that just like carry us in and hold us in. I think that's something that does not happen in many other spaces outside of Indigenous realms. And I don't know how, it's always so unfortunate, or not unfortunate, it's so hard to explain to folks what it's actually like within spaces that are for or with Indigenous people, because you can't replicate that. You can't really explain the electricity and the warmth that comes from that. So for me, how has it felt? I think I've been able to connect with some very strong human beings that have been able to support me and protect me and really guide me. So it's felt overwhelming at times, but through the love and warmth of the smaller team, but overall team and other Two-Spirit elders and knowledge keepers that I've been able to connect with throughout my career, I felt to do this work. But that's not to say that the backpack that's still on my back isn't extremely heavy every day. So knowing that I can come to you, Lori, anytime, or knowing that I can come to management anytime, really to have these conversations and to have conversations just about feeling overwhelmed, and that sometimes there's no fix for that except for listening and just feeling. That's kind of my response, I think.
Thank you, Jesse. Apologies for the coughing. Lori, go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, Jesse, I think I resonate with you in that it shifts when you have this like connection. And I think there's something about culture with that. And then I think about that when I think about nursing. As soon as you're in the world and you're like, well, I'm a nurse, me too. There's like this instant connection. And I'm like, how can we mirror that so that that's built just into the system? Like we're on the same team, making space for each other and appreciating and valuing each other. And I think like in the Indigenous health team, that's definitely there because we're, trying to influence and shift. But I really want to figure out how to apply that outside of our team and in the rest of that system, because the journey is hard enough and the topics are difficult and they're so different than the current system. And so, yeah, making that space, I don't know, something for me to think about. Thanks for your answers. I really appreciate that.
And I think, Lori, to your point, like, I think it's something that I've been like, even in nursing school, when I met other student nurses, you're right. Like there's these certain situations that have this electricity and this energy in this community that like, I've always wondered how to bottle up. And I think that's, a part of ICS and a part of like, when we do hold space that are Indigenous specific spaces, but allowing allies in to witness and experience that electricity and that love and that warmth. I think that's like that's where some of that change can come. I was like very fortunate to go to a Two-Spirit event, I guess 2 weeks ago now, which is wild how fast it was. And it was just only for Two-Spirit queer and trans folks, but there were some allies and some leaders there that weren't a part of the community, but them being able to witness and experience that love and connection and that deep rooted, they left like overwhelmed with joy, but also just responsibility and eagerness to fight and make change with and for the community. So that's a part of it, I guess, which is difficult on Zoom, of course, but I see Nicole's hands up, so I'll pass it over to you, Nicole.
One of the main reasons I became a community planner was to capture that kinship and bring folks to the table. And the best way I think I can say that I've learned that is through watching the matriarchs in my family navigate and hold, ceremony and potlatch. And the reason why I hold them in such high esteem is because those elders are all my aunties, but they're all in a state of remembering. They were all part of the residential school, so they're trying to remember and mirror what grandma did. And so ever since I was little, nobody ever told me this is how we do it, or this is why we do it, or we do this because we're Decas, or we do this because we're what. So nobody says that, right? You don't watch your mom cook a turkey dinner and she goes, okay, now I'm going to measure the gravy, or now I'm going to cut the potatoes. Nobody does that in my family. I don't think that's the way we learn. But I learned by watching my mom make her stuffing from scratch ever since I could stand beside her by the stove. And I do it now exactly the same way my mom does it without writing instructions. And so I think it's about being who we are in our true essence. And I always talk about coming from here first and not here, because this is what leads our work, and it's heart-led work. And if you can't inspire others or be moved by others, then I think they're in the wrong job. Like, if you're not going to be inspired by clan work, like, hey, I can't help you. Like, I can't tell you what it looks like to watch, 6 amazing matriarchs come together without a book, practicing a culture, a few hundred years old, without, written knowledge of who our bloodline is. All we have to say is, I'm Lixilu, I'm from Stalaten, and this is my grandpa, and then I'll know all my relatives from the lower part of Quesnel all the way to Whitsett or Hazelton. Like, that's mind-blowing. And so it's hard to inspire others who don't have that concept or understanding, but I do my best to act it and be that young matriarch in training in community all the time, in every meeting, and remind folks we all have a story. And I will say, hearing all your stories today was really moving. And one of the most powerful tools I learned in SCARP, when we were all meeting our cohort, of 70 plus people, one of the planners that came in was from City Hall and talking about finding your people. Find your people wherever you're at, because you need people to support you, cheer you on, stand beside you. And so once you hear somebody's story, it's hard to turn them away. So sharing your stories, and one of the main questions what I heard was, how did your family or people come to Canada? And then that opened a whole dialogue of, I didn't know half of my cohort was American. I assumed they were all from Ontario. But it changed my perspective, because all their grandparents escaped the war. And it really put it in perspective for me. So I don't know if you can do that in every meeting, but at some point, icebreakers are really useful. Sharing little stories and learning a little bit about each person in every meeting, because that's breaking the ice and that's building relationships. And you should make time for that, 15 minutes at least, if you can. And that way you can inspire and connect to others. So that's something I do in my practice. I just wanted to share. So let's see, Joe.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, James. Just aware of time there.
Yeah. I just wanted to finish up by saying thank you to everyone for today. I am including in the chat a survey link for today's session. It's the second one. Sorry, the first one is the Nexus webcast from yesterday. So that first link will show you, if you'd like to see the Louis Riel dance workshop yesterday. The second one is from surveys from VCH, and we would encourage and invite everyone to let us know what they thought about the session today through that survey link. So please, if you have a moment, please take a 1 second to copy and paste that surveys link before it disappears when we finish up our session today. And lastly, for the rest of this week, we have one more event coming tomorrow. So there is Friday, November 18th, we will have Alexa Lizotte from Desert Métis Creation presenting the history of Métis beadwork, First Nations, and European artwork that birthed Métis customs. So that's tomorrow, noon to 1, our final lunch and learn for the week of Louis Riel. So that's our presentation today. We hope you enjoyed it. Aishka Osiam, thank you everyone for joining and for your thoughts. And we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Bye for now.
Great job. Thanks.